At 9 in the evening, Pacific Standard Time on January 26th, in the year 1700, a 600-mile-long stretch of the Pacific Ocean floor suddenly slipped, and a winter coastline in what would one day be called the Pacific Northwest dropped several feet into the sea. A wall of water crossed the open Pacific in 10 hours and arrived on the coast of Japan with no preceding earthquake felt by anyone living there to explain it. 326 years have passed since that night. The strain has been building, without interruption, the entire time, and every scientist who studies this fault for a living agrees on one point. The next one is coming. The only question is when, and whether the 7 million people now living above the locked interface will be ready when it does. Before we go any further, if you enjoy what we do here at The Outer Layer, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss any of our daily reads. Also, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Let's get into it. Part 1. The Fault Beneath the Pacific Northwest. There is a 600-mile-long crack in the floor of the Pacific Ocean, running from a point off the coast of Cape Mendocino in Northern California, north past the Oregon coastline, past the Washington coastline, and up along the western edge of Vancouver Island in British Columbia. You can't see it. It lies offshore, beneath water that is hundreds to thousands of feet deep, in a region where no human being has ever stood. But it is there, and the people who study it for a living can tell you exactly where its trace runs on a map. They can tell you how steeply it dips beneath the continent. They can tell you how fast the plates on either side of it are moving past each other. They can tell you how much energy it has stored, and how much energy it will release the next time it slips. What they cannot tell you with any precision is when that next slip will happen. It could happen tomorrow, it could happen in 10 years, it could happen in 100 years. But the geological record, which goes back roughly 10,000 years, is clear on one point. It will happen. And when it does, the part of the world we currently call the Pacific Northwest will be reshaped in a way that no part of the United States has been reshaped in living memory. This is the Cascadia subduction zone. It is where one tectonic plate is being shoved beneath another, and it is the single largest, most dangerous and most underappreciated fault in the continental United States. To understand what is happening down there, you have to picture two great slabs of rock pressed together along a line. The slab on the west is called the Juan de Fuca Plate. It is a relatively small piece of oceanic crust, born at a ridge about 300 miles offshore, where new rock is being made constantly by upwelling magma. As that new rock cools and accumulates, it pushes the older rock to the east. The Juan de Fuca Plate is drifting toward North America at a rate of about 40 millimeters per year. That is approximately the rate at which a human fingernail grows. It is slow, it is steady, and it is unrelenting. The slab on the east is the North American Plate. It is the giant continental plate that holds most of the United States, Canada, and Mexico. It is far thicker, far older, and far more buoyant than the oceanic plate to its west. When the two meet, the lighter, thicker continental rock wins. The Juan de Fuca Plate is being driven downward and eastward, beneath the edge of the North American continent. That descent is what geologists call subduction, and the inclined surface where the two plates meet is the subduction zone. Most of the time, that surface is locked. The two plates are pressed against each other so hard, and the rock at the interface is so cold and brittle that they don't slide. The Juan de Fuca Plate keeps trying to move eastward, but it can't, because it's stuck against the underside of North America. What happens instead is that the continental plate, the one we are standing on, begins to deform. Imagine pushing a heavy table across a carpet and feeling the carpet bunch up in front of the leg. The leading edge of North America is bunching up. The land is being squeezed and bent and elevated. Every year the coast of Oregon and Washington moves about an inch closer to the interior. Every year, the rock at the locked surface stores a little more of the energy that the Juan de Fuca Plate is delivering. That stored energy has a name. It is called elastic strain, and it is being added to a reservoir that has been filling, with no significant withdrawals, for 326 years. The locked portion of the fault, the part that is doing the storing, runs from about 10 kilometers below the seafloor, down to a depth of roughly 30 to 45 kilometers. From east to west, the locked zone is about 80 to 100 kilometers wide. From north to south, it is about 1,000 kilometers long. That is roughly the area of West Virginia, but oriented vertically, tilted into the earth like a giant ramp, with the shallow end out under the continental shelf and the deep end driven beneath the western edge of the continent. Somewhere in that enormous tilted plain, every square meter is currently storing strain, and when the rock can no longer hold the strain, it will let go. The release of all that stored energy, all at once, is what we call an earthquake. The energy travels outward as waves in the rock. The waves travel through the crust and the mantle at speeds of kilometers per second. They reach the surface, and they make the ground move. The amount of energy released and the size of the rupture determine how violent the shaking will be and how long it will last. For a subduction zone the size of Cascadia, with the strain that has been built up since the year 1700, the next rupture is expected to release energy equivalent to a magnitude 9 earthquake. A magnitude 9 earthquake is not a magnitude 8 earthquake that is one larger. Each step up the magnitude scale represents roughly 32 times more energy released. A magnitude 9 is approximately 32 times more energetic than a magnitude 8. It is approximately 1,000 times more energetic than a magnitude 7. It is approximately 45 times more energetic than the famous 1906 San Francisco earthquake, which leveled most of San Francisco and killed an estimated 3,000 people. The next Cascadia earthquake will dwarf 1906 the way a hurricane dwarfs a thunderstorm. But there is a more important difference. A magnitude 9 on a long fault like Cascadia does not produce 30 seconds of violent shaking. It produces 3 minutes. It produces 4 minutes. It can produce 5 full minutes. Stand still for that long. Try it sometime. Count the seconds. Now imagine that for every one of those seconds, the ground beneath you is moving. Buildings are swaying. Power lines are whipping. Windows are exploding. Soil is liquefying. Bridges are warping. Fuel tanks are tipping. You don't experience an earthquake like that as a brief event. You experience it as something that is happening to the world. And that is what is locked into the geometry beneath the Pacific Northwest. That is what is waiting. That is what the carpet is bunching toward. The geology has been clear about this for 30 years. The science is not in dispute. The mathematics of the elastic strain are not in dispute. The recurrent statistics are not in dispute. The only thing that remains, the only unknown, is the timing. And the timing is not on our side. It is worth pausing for a second on the question of how much energy we're talking about. The strain energy that has accumulated in the locked Cascadia interface over the last 326 years is, by any measure, an extraordinary quantity. The current best estimate, based on the convergence rate, the locked area, and the elastic properties of the rock, is on the order of 10 to the 25th joules. That is a number that does not mean much in everyday units, so let me give you a comparison. 10 to the 25th joules is approximately equivalent to the energy that the entire human civilization consumes in roughly 500 years at current rates. It is approximately 10 million times the energy released by the largest hydrogen bomb ever detonated. It is approximately 100 million times the energy released by the meteor that struck Chelyabinsk in 2013. The strain energy currently stored in the Cascadia interface, in other words, is not a quantity that human beings have any direct experience with. It is a planetary scale phenomenon, and when it finally releases, it will do so in a planetary scale way. The fault itself, as a physical structure, is also worth picturing more clearly. It is not a single clean crack in the rock. It is a complicated zone of deformation, with the main interface in the middle and a series of subsidiary faults branching upward from it through the upper plate, and a series of features in the downgoing plate below it. The main interface, the one that will host the next rupture, is a surface of intense shear, hundreds of meters thick in some places, where the two plates are grinding past each other under enormous pressure. The temperature at the interface ranges from a few degrees Celsius at the shallow up-dip end where seawater can circulate and cool the rock, to several hundred degrees Celsius at the deep down-dip end where the rock is hot enough to flow plastically rather than slip in brittle earthquakes. The brittle to plastic transition is what defines the bottom edge of the locked zone, and the temperature there is one of the controls on how deep the rupture can extend. Above the locked zone, in the upper plate, the rock is being deformed by the accumulating strain. Modern continuous GPS networks across the Pacific Northwest measure the deformation directly. Stations along the coast move slightly eastward, by a few millimeters per year, as the upper plate is dragged inland by the descending oceanic plate. Stations further inland show smaller motions in the same direction. The pattern of GPS motions integrated across the Pacific Northwest gives a real-time picture of the elastic strain accumulating in the upper plate. The picture is unambiguous. The strain is climbing. The pattern matches what we would expect from a fully locked interface. The integration of 3 decades of GPS data, combined with the offshore turbidite record, combined with the dated 1700 event, all converges on the same answer. The fault is locked, the strain is building, the release is coming. Part 2. A coast that was supposed to be quiet. It is hard now to remember that the Cascadia subduction zone was once considered to be a place where nothing happened. But for the entire history of European and American presence in the Pacific Northwest, that was the consensus view. The fault was, in the language of geologists, considered aseismic, meaning that it did not produce earthquakes. There were no eyewitness accounts of catastrophic shaking. There were no records of giant tsunamis. There were no instrumentally recorded large events. The Cascadia margin sat there, looking on the map like the kind of structure that should produce major earthquakes, and yet none had ever been observed. So when Portland was platted in the 1840s, no one designed it for a magnitude 9 earthquake. When Seattle's first brick warehouses went up in the 1870s and 80s, no one anchored them for the kind of shaking that a megathrust event delivers. When the great wooden trestles of the Northern Pacific Railway crossed the rivers and ravines of Oregon and Washington in the late 19th century, they were built to handle locomotives and washouts, not 3 minutes of accelerations approaching 1 full G. When the Burnside Bridge crossed the Willamette in 1926, when the Tacoma Narrows opened to traffic, when the fuel tanks at what would later become known as the Critical Energy Infrastructure Hub began to rise on the alluvial muds of northwest Portland, there was no awareness, in the design, that the ground beneath them could one day jump 4 feet sideways in a matter of seconds and stay jumping for several minutes. The Pacific Northwest was built in the dark. The people who built it were not lazy or careless. They simply did not know. The science had not yet caught up. The geology was not yet visible. And there was, in fairness, a certain plausibility to the assumption that no megaquakes had ever happened, because no megaquakes had been recorded in any way that mid-20th century scientists were equipped to find. The oral histories of the indigenous peoples of the region contained, in retrospect, dozens of references to a great earth-shaking and a great wave, but those accounts were either dismissed as mythology or were simply not part of the conversation. The marsh stratigraphers, who would eventually find the buried evidence, had not yet started digging. The dendrochronologists who would eventually count the rings of the dead trees had not yet looked. The Japanese historical archives, which contained the most precise evidence of all, had not yet been connected to the American problem. The pieces were there, they had not yet been assembled. So when the city of Portland grew, it grew over liquefiable soils. When the city of Seattle grew, it grew over a deep sedimentary basin that amplifies seismic shaking by factors of 2 and 3. When the natural gas pipelines, the high-pressure water mains, the high-voltage transmission corridors, the regional airports, the fuel depots, and the 8,000 miles of major highway in Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia were laid out, they were laid out without reference to the fault that was building strain 300 miles offshore. The first hints that something was wrong began to appear in the late 1970s and into the 1980s. Geophysicists looked more carefully at the offshore seafloor. They noticed that the topography looked, structurally, exactly like the topography off the coast of Alaska, where the great 1964 magnitude 9.2 earthquake had occurred. They noticed that it looked, structurally, exactly like the topography off the coast of Chile, where the great 1960 magnitude 9.5 earthquake had occurred. They noticed that the geometry of the Juan de Fuca plate's descent matched the geometry of plates that had recently produced the largest earthquakes ever recorded, and they began to ask, with rising alarm, the question that no one had previously asked. If Cascadia looks like every other megathrust on Earth, and if every other megathrust on Earth produces magnitude 9 earthquakes, why are we so confident that Cascadia does not? The honest answer, when scientists finally arrived at it, was that we had not been looking. We had assumed Cascadia was different because we had never seen it produce a megaquake. But the recurrence interval for megaquakes at a place like Cascadia is hundreds of years. The recorded history of European settlement in the Pacific Northwest was, at that point, less than 200 years. We had not been there long enough to see one. We had drawn the conclusion that no earthquakes occur from the fact that none had occurred during our brief presence on the landscape. It was a little like watching a volcano for 10 minutes, seeing no eruption, and concluding that the mountain is extinct. And so, beginning in 1987, a group of geologists led by Brian Atwater of the United States Geological Survey began digging in the salt marshes of coastal Washington. They were looking for evidence of past earthquakes. They were looking for the buried signature that a megathrust event would have left in the landscape. And what they found, very quickly, was that the assumption of an aseismic coast was wrong in the most spectacular way possible. The coast had not been quiet. It had been, in geological terms, extraordinarily violent. We just hadn't been there to see it. That discovery, the discovery that the Cascadia subduction zone is in fact one of the most dangerous structures on the planet, is one of the great scientific stories of the late 20th century, and it begins, of all places, in a swamp. But before we get to the swamp, it is worth dwelling on the cost of the assumption that preceded the discovery. The Pacific Northwest grew during the late 19th and 20th centuries into one of the more important industrial regions of North America. Portland became a major port and timber processing center. Seattle became the home of Boeing and, later, of much of the country's software industry. Tacoma developed as a deep-water container port. Vancouver, British Columbia grew into one of the most populous cities in Canada. The smaller cities of the I-5 corridor, from Eugene through Olympia and on to Bellingham, grew up alongside the larger metros. The combined economic output of the region became substantial, and every brick, every span, every concrete pour, every pipe trench was put in place under the assumption that the ground was stable. Where the buildings might have been designed for the kind of shaking that the geology was secretly preparing, they were instead designed for the wind, for the rain, for the freeze-thaw cycle, for the loads of trucks and elevators and people. Those are real engineering concerns, and the engineers solved them well. But the seismic question, the one that had not yet been asked, was the one that mattered most, and it was the one that was not part of the design. It is striking, when you look at the historical record, how casually the assumption was made. There were people in the late 19th and early 20th centuries who looked at the Cascadia coastline and noticed that it resembled, in its overall geometry, the coasts of South America and southern Alaska. There were geologists who knew, in a general way, that subduction zones produced earthquakes. But the inferential leap from "this looks like a subduction zone" to "this will produce magnitude 9 earthquakes" was not made until the 1980s, and so the cities grew, and the bridges were built, and the fuel depots were sited, and the assumption was never examined. By the time the assumption was finally examined, in the late 1980s and into the 1990s, the cost of unwinding it had become enormous. To retrofit the building stock of Portland and Seattle and Vancouver to modern seismic standards would, by any plausible estimate, cost tens of billions of dollars. To replace the older bridges across the major rivers, billions more. To relocate the critical energy infrastructure hub away from its liquefiable site in northwest Portland, billions more on top of that. The total cost of bringing the Pacific Northwest infrastructure into alignment with what the geology now tells us it ought to be is, in some estimates, comparable to the gross domestic product of a small country. The work has been done in pieces, over decades, but the scale of the remaining gap is large enough that no realistic budget can close it before the next event arrives. That is the cost of having been wrong for 2 centuries about whether the coast was quiet. The geology did not care that we thought it was quiet. The strain accumulated all the same. The clock ran all the same. The fact that we were not paying attention is, in the end, simply a fact about us. The fault did not adjust its schedule for our convenience. Part 3. Ghost Forests and Tree Rings. If you walk out at low tide along certain stretches of the Washington coast, in places like Copalis or Willapa Bay, or along the Neowicum River, you will see something that does not, at first glance, look remarkable. You will see a few dead trees standing in the marsh. Their bark is gone. Their branches are stripped down to grey stubs. Their roots are still anchored in the mud. The water of the tidal flat washes around them at every cycle of the tides, twice a day, every day. They are obviously dead, and they have obviously been dead for a long time, but they are standing. That detail, that they are standing, is the key to everything. Western red cedars do not grow in salt water. They grow in upland forests, in well-drained soils, sometimes 10 or 20 feet above the high tide line. Cedars in salt water die quickly. Their roots cannot tolerate the salt. They drown, and the salt poisons them, and they collapse. Cedars that have died in salt water do not stay standing for centuries. They fall down, decay, and become part of the mud. So when Brian Atwater walked out into those tidal flats in the late 1980s and saw acres of standing dead cedars with their roots in salt water that they could not possibly have grown in, he knew that something had happened to the landscape. Specifically, he knew that the land had dropped. The trees had grown for centuries in upland conditions. Then something had pushed the land surface down suddenly, to a level below the high tide line. The cedars had drowned. They had died standing where they grew, and the marsh had built up around their feet over the following centuries, preserving them. What kind of event could cause an entire stretch of forested coastline to drop suddenly into the intertidal zone? Atwater knew exactly what kind: a megathrust earthquake. When a subduction zone ruptures, the upper plate snaps westward toward the trench. The coast on the inland side of the rupture drops. In Alaska in 1964, sections of the coast dropped by 10 feet during the Great Earthquake. In Chile in 1960, sections of the coast dropped even more dramatically. And in every case, the drop was preserved in the local stratigraphy. Drowned forests, killed marshes, sand layers from the tsunami that followed, all stacked one on top of the next in the layers of the soil. Atwater began digging. He dug pits in the marsh. He dug cores. He looked at the layers, and what he saw was the classic signature of a great megaquake. At a depth of about a metre below the modern marsh surface, he found a thin, sharp layer of well-developed upland soil. That was the original ground surface before the event. Right above it was a layer of sand, sometimes a few millimetres thick, sometimes several centimetres. That sand was the tsunami deposit, the wave that had washed in from the ocean after the earthquake and laid down its load of coastal sand on the newly drowned surface. Right above the sand was a layer of intertidal marsh mud, the silt that had accumulated in the centuries since, in the lower elevation environment that the earthquake had created. 3 layers, 3 lines in the stratigraphy, each one telling a story. The same pattern showed up at one site after another along the Washington and Oregon coasts. The same signature, the same story, a buried soil, a sand layer above it, marsh mud above that. And in many places in the layers below the most recent event, more buried soils, more sand layers, more marsh mud, earthquake after earthquake after earthquake, stacked in the geological record like the pages of a book that nobody had read for 10,000 years. The next question was when? When had the most recent event happened? Atwater knew, from the marsh stratigraphy, that the event was recent. The dead trees were still standing, which meant the event was within the last few hundred years. But how do you date something more precisely than that? The answer came from a tree ring scientist at the University of Washington named David Yamaguchi. Yamaguchi was a dendrochronologist. His job was to read the rings of trees the way a forensic scientist reads a piece of evidence at a crime scene. Every ring in a tree corresponds to 1 year of growth. Wide rings mean good years, with plenty of water and warmth. Narrow rings mean bad years, with drought or cold. The pattern of wide and narrow rings is unique to a specific stretch of time in a specific region, like a fingerprint. By matching the pattern of rings in a dead tree to the pattern of rings in nearby living trees, a dendrochronologist can determine the year in which any given ring grew. And the outermost ring of a dead tree, the last ring before the tree stopped growing, tells you the last year the tree was alive. Yamaguchi went out to the ghost forest with Atwater. He took cores of the dead trees, he brought them back to the lab, and he counted, and he matched, and he compared. The work took years. The patterns in some of the trees were ambiguous or partial or damaged by decay. But over time, a clear answer began to emerge. The outermost ring of the dead cedars in the Washington marshes was the ring that had grown in 1699. The trees had completed the growing season of that year, laid down a final ring, gone dormant for the winter, and then never grown again. Whatever had killed them sometime between the autumn of 1699 and the spring of 1700. Think about that for a moment. 2 centuries before the United States Geological Survey existed, 100 years before Lewis and Clark reached the Pacific, before the first European had laid eyes on the Oregon coast, before any wagon had crossed the Cascades, long before any city now standing in the Pacific Northwest had been founded, in the dead of winter, in a year that on the European calendar was the cusp of the 18th century. The ground beneath the Pacific Northwest dropped several feet, and a tsunami washed in from the ocean, and a few acres of red cedars in coastal Washington died standing where they grew. Atwater and Yamaguchi had, between them, established two pieces of the puzzle. They had established that a great earthquake had occurred, and they had established that it had happened in the window of late 1699 to early 1700. What they had not established was the day. They could not pin it down beyond a single growing season, and there is no reason in principle that anyone should have been able to pin it down beyond a growing season. A buried marsh and a dead tree can give you a year. They cannot give you an hour. The events of the early 1700s in the Pacific Northwest were not written down, because the cultures that lived in the Pacific Northwest in the early 1700s did not use written language. The oral histories of the coastal tribes contained, in retrospect, accounts of the event, but those accounts could not, on their own, be tied to a specific calendar date by anyone in 1990. The story seemed to end there. We knew an earthquake had happened. We knew it had happened around 1700. We could not know more. And then, in 1993, a Japanese seismologist named Kenji Satake heard about the work being done in Washington, and he realized before anyone else that a great earthquake off the coast of North America in the year 1700 should have left a record. Not in North America, in Japan. And the record, if it existed, would tell us exactly when the earthquake had happened, to within an hour. Connect the strain that built up in the locked Cascadia interface to what science had been searching for, and you arrive at the moment when an idea formed across an ocean. Part 4. The tsunami that hit Japan with no earthquake. The reasoning that Kenji Satake brought to the problem was elegant, almost embarrassingly so. It went like this. A magnitude 9 earthquake on the Cascadia subduction zone would have dropped the seafloor along a 600-mile stretch of the continental margin by several meters. The displaced water would have formed a tsunami. The tsunami would have propagated outward across the open Pacific Ocean. Tsunamis in deep water travel at the speed of a passenger jet, somewhere around 500 miles per hour, and they slow only when they enter shallow coastal water. A tsunami leaving the coast of Washington at 9 o'clock on a winter evening would have reached the coast of Japan in about 10 hours. It would have arrived along the coast of Honshu in the middle of the night, Japan time, and if anyone in Japan had been awake to see it, they would have seen waves come ashore with no preceding earthquake felt anywhere in their country. Japan in the year 1700 had a sophisticated culture, a centralized bureaucracy, and a literate coastal population. Coastal villages along the Sanriku coast and the Pacific shoreline of Honshu kept careful records of unusual events. The records were maintained by village officials, by temple scribes, by domain administrators, by the bureaucracy of the Tokugawa shogunate. They tracked births, deaths, tax collections, crop yields, weather, fires, and disasters. They used a calendar system, derived from the Chinese one but adapted to local use, that allowed any date to be recorded with precision to the day and sometimes to the hour. Satake's intuition was that somewhere in the historical archives of Japan, there would be a record of a tsunami arriving in the middle of the night with no felt earthquake to explain it, and if he could find that record and read its date and read its description of the waves, he could back-calculate everything he needed to know about the Cascadia event. So he began searching the archives. He worked with Kunihiko Shimazaki and others. He looked at temple records, he looked at village histories, he looked at administrative reports filed by domain officials and forwarded to the shogunate, and what he found in multiple archives along the Honshu coast was the same event recorded in different places by different observers. Around the hour of the tiger, which in the Japanese 12-period day corresponds to roughly 2 o'clock in the morning to 4 o'clock in the morning, on what corresponds in our modern calendar to the night of January 27th into the morning of January 28th. In the year that the Japanese reckoned as Genroku 12, in the second month, on the 8th and 9th days, waves had come ashore at multiple locations. The accounts described damage to fishing villages. They described boats lifted off their moorings and carried inland. They described houses flooded. They described damage to salt storage sheds and to rice paddies. They described deaths. At one location, the water rose to inundate a series of merchant warehouses and damaged the stockpile of goods inside. At another, the wave overtopped the seawall and flooded a low-lying district. The accounts came from places hundreds of miles apart along the coast, and the timing in each one was consistent. The wave had arrived at the predicted speed for a transoceanic tsunami, originating in the eastern Pacific, 10 or 11 hours before its arrival in Japan. and in every account the same anomaly was noted. The waves had come ashore with no preceding earthquake felt anywhere on the Japanese islands. In Japan, this kind of tsunami had a name. It was called an orphan tsunami, a wave with no parent earthquake, a flood with no felt shaking to explain it. A disaster that seemed to come from nowhere, to a country that was perfectly equipped to record it. Satak had what he needed. He took the arrival times at the various Japanese ports. He took the wave heights, where they were described in detail. He took the distances from each port to the point on the Cascadia margin that the geometry of a megathrust rupture would have generated the tsunami from, and he ran the calculation backward. He computed when the source earthquake would have had to occur in order for the wave to arrive in Japan at the times that the archives described. The answer was 9 o'clock in the evening, Pacific Standard Time, on January 26th in the year 1700, a Friday. He published the work in the journal Nature in 1996. This was, when it appeared, an extraordinary result. It was the first time in the history of seismology that a prehistoric earthquake had been dated to the hour. 3 separate independent lines of evidence had converged on the same answer. The marsh stratigraphy of coastal Washington said an earthquake had occurred. The tree rings of the ghost forest cedars said it had happened in the window of late 1699 to early 1700. The Japanese archives said it had happened at 9 o'clock in the evening on the 26th of January. 3 pieces of evidence gathered by 3 different research traditions, separated by thousands of miles, and all pointing to the same event: the fault, the drowning, the wave that crossed an ocean, the villages flooded in the dark, the bureaucrats writing down what they had seen. And this is the part of the story that should sit with you for a moment, because the entire scientific community of the late 20th century, working independently across 3 continents, was able to converge on a date and time for an earthquake that no living human had witnessed, that no piece of instrumented equipment had recorded, that no contemporary historian had described from direct observation. That convergence is one of the great achievements of modern geology, and it has a consequence. Because if we know that the last earthquake happened at 9 o'clock on a January night in 1700, then we know exactly how long it has been since the last one. We can count the years, we can hold the elapsed interval up against the recurrent statistics, and we can read, from the geological record, what the implications are for the future. The 1700 event is not just history, it is the clock. The clock is running. And every paper that has been published on the Cascadia hazard since Sataki's 1996 paper has been, in some sense, a meditation on what that ticking clock is going to deliver. Part 5. 41 Events in 10,000 Years. By the late 1990s, the dating of the 1700 earthquake was established. The mechanism was understood. The general expectation that another such event would eventually occur was widely accepted by the geological community. But there remained a critical missing piece. How often, on average, did Cascadia rupture? Was 1700 the only earthquake of its kind in the last few thousand years, or one in a long sequence? If a sequence, how far apart were the events spaced? And given the spacing, what should we make of the 3 centuries that had elapsed since 1700? These questions required a longer record than the marsh stratigraphy alone could provide. The marshes preserved evidence of the most recent few events, but the work of digging pits and reading layers was slow, and the older events, the ones buried under thousands of years of subsequent marsh growth, were difficult to reach from the surface. The geological community needed a record that stretched back not centuries but millennia, and it needed that record from a place where the layers had been continuously deposited and preserved, without the gaps and reworking that affect coastal sediments. The place that turned out to be ideal for this work was the deep ocean floor, several hundred miles offshore at the foot of the continental slope. There, in the abyssal plain of the eastern Pacific, sediment had been raining down quietly for the entire Holocene, the last 10,000 years since the end of the last ice age. The accumulation was steady, slow, and uniform under most circumstances, but every time a great Cascadia earthquake shook the continental slope, that shaking triggered submarine landslides. The slides sent dense slurries of sand and mud cascading down the slope and out across the abyssal plain. Each slide deposited a recognizable layer, coarser grained than the background sediment, sometimes a few centimeters thick, sometimes much more. These layers were called turbidites, after the turbid water that produced them, and a single Great Cascadia earthquake should have produced a single turbidite layer deposited at the same time at every point along the abyssal plain that the slides reached. The geologist who took on the work of reading this record was Chris Goldfinger of Oregon State University. Starting in the 1990s and continuing for decades, Goldfinger and his collaborators took sediment cores from the abyssal plain at multiple locations along the Cascadia margin. They cored at the mouths of the major submarine canyons that drain off the continental slope. They cored offshore from Oregon. They cored offshore from Washington. They cored offshore from Northern California. And in each core they counted the turbidite layers, dated them with radiocarbon, and built up a chronology of the earthquakes that had triggered them. What Goldfinger and his team found after decades of work is one of the most detailed long-term earthquake records in the world. Over the last 10,000 years, the Cascadia subduction zone has produced at least 41 major earthquakes. Of those, 19 were full margin ruptures, comparable in scale to the 1700 event, extending along essentially the entire length of the fault from Cape Mendocino to Vancouver Island. The remaining events were smaller, segment-only ruptures, confined either to the southern portion of the margin between Cape Mendocino and Cape Blanco, or to other partial sections. The recurrence statistics that emerge from this work are not comforting. The mean recurrence interval for full margin events, the great magnitude 9 kind, is approximately 530 years. The mean recurrence interval for the southern segment alone, taking into account both full margin events and southern-only events, is approximately 240 years. The standard deviations are large. Individual recurrence intervals have ranged from a few hundred years to over 1,000. But the central tendency is clear, and so is the implication. 326 years have elapsed since 1700. That is 61% of the average recurrence for full margin events. It is also 136% of the average recurrence for southern segment events. The southern segment, in other words, is past its mean recurrence interval. It is, by the central tendency of the geological record, overdue. The full margin is not yet overdue by the same measure, but it is well within the credible window in which a full margin event could occur. The United States Geological Survey takes these statistics and combines them with everything else known about the fault to produce hazard probabilities. The current published numbers, which appear in the National Seismic Hazard Model and in the joint assessments produced by the USGS, the Pacific Northwest Seismic Network, and the Cascadia Region Earthquake Work Group, are these. The probability of a magnitude 8 or greater earthquake on the southern Cascadia segment within the next 50 years is approximately 37%. The probability of a magnitude 9 or greater full margin event within the next 50 years is approximately 10 to 15%. Take a moment with those numbers. 37% in the next 50 years. That is roughly the probability of flipping a coin and getting 2 tails in a row, except instead of 2 tails meaning nothing, 2 tails means a magnitude 8 earthquake on the Cascadia margin. Imagine if you were told that your house had a 37% chance of burning down in the next half-century. You would not consider that a comfortable probability. You would not say, well, that means there's a 63% chance my house won't burn down, and decide to do nothing. You would, in any rational ordering of priorities, buy fire insurance, install a smoke detector, and develop an evacuation plan. 37% is not low. 37% is, by the standards of natural hazard estimation, extraordinarily high. To put it in the same frame that insurance actuaries use, the annualized probability of a major Cascadia event on the southern segment is approximately 0.7% per year. The annualized probability of a full margin event is approximately 0.2% per year. Those numbers sound small. They look small on the page. But every year you do not have the event, the probability of having it the following year is, in some sense, slightly higher, because the strain has continued to accumulate. The clock does not reset itself. The probability is not memoryless in the way that, say, a coin flip is memoryless. The longer the wait, the more loaded the system becomes, and the higher the probability of release in any given interval, and the cumulative probability integrated over a human lifetime is much larger than the annualized number suggests. Over 50 years, the southern segment cumulative probability climbs to 37%. Over 100 years, it climbs much higher. The pattern is not subtle. The 10 to 15% probability for a full magnitude 9 event is lower, but it is also catastrophic in a way that the southern segment number, as bad as that is, does not quite capture. A southern segment magnitude 8 will be terrible. A full margin magnitude 9 will be the worst earthquake in the recorded history of the United States. The two scenarios are not different versions of the same disaster. They are different categories of disaster, with the full margin event in a category that the United States has never previously experienced. And the point of the recurrence statistics, the reason geologists have been working for 30 years to refine them, is to tell us that neither scenario can be excluded. The southern segment is overdue. The full margin is within the window. We are not standing somewhere safe and benign on the timeline. We are standing on the steep upward slope of a curve that has only one direction. The probability is climbing every year. The strain is increasing every year. The reservoir is filling. The clock is running. And no matter what we want to be true about the timing is not on our side. Part 6. What the shaking will do. To understand what the next Cascadia earthquake will do to the Pacific Northwest, you have to begin with the duration of the shaking. Almost everyone has experienced at one time or another a small earthquake, a jolt that lasts a few seconds, a rattle of windows, a swaying of the light fixtures. Those events are crustal earthquakes generated by short ruptures on relatively short faults. They are over almost before they begin. They produce 20 seconds of significant shaking at most, and they leave behind a residue of broken china and rattled nerves and not much more. A megathrust earthquake is a fundamentally different phenomenon. The rupture front travels along the fault at roughly 2 to 3 kilometers per second. On a 1,000-kilometer fault, the rupture takes between 5 and 7 minutes to complete. The shaking at any given location continues for as long as the rupture is still propagating, plus the time it takes for the seismic waves from the most distant portion of the rupture to reach that location. For a full margin Cascadia event, the resulting shaking at the surface is expected to last between 3 and 5 minutes. Stand still for 3 minutes. Stand still for 5 minutes. You cannot do it. Your body wants to shift, to move, to do something. Now imagine that for that entire duration, the ground beneath you is moving violently in unpredictable directions. The peak ground accelerations expected along the outer coast of Oregon and Washington are between half a g and 1 full g. That means that horizontal accelerations equal to half the force of gravity, and at moments equal to the full force of gravity, will be sustained for minutes. Inland, the accelerations are lower, but they are still severe. At Portland, at Seattle, at Vancouver, peak ground accelerations are expected to be between 0.2 g and 0.4 g, sustained over the same multi-minute duration. What happens to buildings when you do that to them? It depends on the building. Modern construction, designed and built to current seismic codes in Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia, is generally expected to perform reasonably well. The codes incorporate ductile detailing, continuous load paths, and base isolation in some cases. A well-designed, code-compliant building can sustain significant shaking and still stand up and protect its occupants. The challenge is that not all of the buildings in the Pacific Northwest are well-designed and code-compliant. In fact, depending on how you count, the majority of them are not. There are two categories of building stock that are particularly dangerous in the kind of event that Cascadia will produce. The first is unreinforced masonry, often referred to as URM. These are brick or stone buildings, mostly built in the late 1800s and early 1900s, in which the floor framing is set into pockets in the masonry walls. There is no mechanical connection between the floors and the walls. When the building shakes back and forth, the walls and the floors tend to separate. The walls fall outward, usually into the street. The floors lose their support and pancake down on top of each other. Almost every old downtown in the Pacific Northwest, from Eugene to Bellingham, has a significant inventory of URM buildings, and many of them are still in active use as housing, offices, restaurants, and storefronts. The city of Portland publishes a public map of identified URMs. The city of Seattle has a similar inventory. Retrofitting URMs is expensive and politically contentious, and progress has been slow. The second category is non-ductile concrete. These are concrete frame buildings, typically constructed between the 1940s and the early 1990s, before modern detailing requirements were adopted. Concrete is strong in compression but brittle in tension. Without adequate steel reinforcement and without proper detailing of the joints between beams and columns, a concrete frame under severe lateral loading does not deform gracefully. It cracks, then it crushes, then it collapses, often without warning. Non-ductile concrete buildings have been responsible for some of the worst single-event fatality counts in earthquakes around the world. They are present in significant numbers in every major Pacific Northwest city, and they are extremely difficult to retrofit. A widely cited estimate from West Coast seismic studies is that approximately 70% of the built infrastructure of western United States cities, excluding wood frame houses, does not meet modern seismic standards. That number includes URM and non-ductile concrete, but also a long tail of other vulnerable structures: tilt-up concrete with inadequate roof-to-wall connections, older steel frame buildings with brittle weld details, and various hybrid construction types that have not been seismically evaluated. Single-family wood frame houses, the dominant residential type in the Pacific Northwest, are in better shape on average. The flexibility of wood framing allows these houses to absorb a great deal of lateral motion without catastrophic failure. The principal risks in wood frame houses are falling objects inside, collapse of unsecured chimneys, failure of cripple walls in older homes, and homes sliding off their foundations when the building was not bolted down. These last two failure modes are common in homes built before the mid-1990s in jurisdictions that did not have effective seismic codes. A house that slides off its foundation may not collapse, but it will typically be uninhabitable and may be a total loss. The retrofit, which involves bolting the house to its foundation and adding plywood sheathing to the cripple walls, is a few thousand to $10,000 in most cases. Many homeowners have not done it. Many do not know it is necessary. Now add the soil to the picture. Large portions of the Pacific Northwest's urban areas are built on saturated alluvial fill. The Willamette River Valley through Portland, the Duwamish River Valley through Seattle, the waterfront districts of every major coastal port, the runways of multiple regional airports. Under the kind of sustained shaking that Cascadia will produce, saturated loose soils undergo what is called liquefaction. The grains lose contact with each other, the water pressure between them rises, the material behaves temporarily like a fluid. Foundations sink into the liquefied soil, buried pipes float to the surface, lateral spreading carries entire blocks of land sideways, sometimes by meters. The damage in liquefaction zones can be more severe than the damage in adjacent areas that are built on competent ground. And then add the specific failure that is, in some respects, the most appalling single vulnerability of the Pacific Northwest. The Critical Energy Infrastructure Hub, known locally as the CEI Hub, is a 6-mile stretch of the Willamette River in northwest Portland, where approximately 90 to 95% of Oregon's transportation fuel is stored: gasoline, diesel, jet fuel. The tanks are tall cylindrical structures, many of them built in the mid-20th century, sitting on alluvial soils that are highly liquefiable. The Oregon Department of Geology and Mineral Industries has published a detailed risk assessment for the CEI Hub, which concluded that a Cascadia Megaquake would cause widespread tank failure, spillage of large quantities of liquid fuel into the river system, post-event fires, and a multi-week to multi-month disruption of fuel supply for the entire region. The risk assessment is, in the language of agency documents, blunt about the magnitude of the consequences. As of this writing, comprehensive structural mitigation of the CEI Hub is not complete. The hub is, in every functional sense, the single most vulnerable concentration of critical infrastructure on the entire West Coast, and it sits exactly where the megaquake will hit hardest. When the shaking stops, 3 to 5 minutes after it starts, the landscape of the Pacific Northwest will be transformed. Bridges will be down or impassable. URMs will have collapsed onto the streets in front of them. Older concrete frames will have failed. Liquefied ground will have swallowed foundations. Power will be out. Water mains will be ruptured. Natural gas lines will be leaking. Fires will be starting from broken gas connections and downed electrical lines. The CEI Hub may already be in the early stages of a multi-tank fuel spill fire, and for everyone east of the coast, that is the moment when the situation begins to clarify. The shaking is over. The damage is what it is. The survivors are taking stock. A few more details about that moment are worth understanding. The power grid across the Pacific Northwest is interconnected with the rest of the Western Interconnection that covers most of the western United States and parts of Canada and Mexico. When the Cascadia event begins, the protection relays at substations will start to trip as transmission lines fault and as load is suddenly lost. The grid will island into smaller sections. In some areas, the islanding will be successful and power will remain on. In many areas, the islanding will fail and the grid will collapse. Restoration will require weeks to months for the most heavily damaged segments. The Bonneville Power Administration, which operates much of the high-voltage transmission backbone in the region, has been working on seismic upgrades for substations and lines, but the inventory is large and the work has been incremental. The water systems serving the major cities depend on transmission mains that cross liquefaction zones at multiple points. Failures along those mains will leave entire neighborhoods without potable water for periods measured in weeks. The Portland Water Bureau and Seattle Public Utilities have both published their own estimates of post-Cascadia recovery timelines, and the numbers in both cases are long. Communications will fail in a pattern that will surprise some residents. Cellular service depends on a combination of cell towers, fiber backhaul, and central switching offices, all of which are vulnerable in different ways. The towers themselves are generally engineered for high wind loads and may survive the shaking, but the backhaul fiber that connects them to the rest of the network is buried in conduit that will rupture in liquefaction zones. The central offices that route the traffic depend on power. When the power goes, the backup generators run as long as the fuel lasts. The fuel runs out in hours to days. After that, the cellular network is down. Landlines, which depend on the same central offices, fail in the same way. The internet, which depends on the same fiber and the same central offices, fails in the same way. The redundancy that we rely on in normal times turns out to be redundancy within a single fragile system, and the system fails together when the shaking is severe enough. The communication infrastructure that does survive in most predictions is the licensed amateur radio service and the regional emergency management radio networks. Those will form the backbone of communication in the first days. People who have invested in a basic two-way radio and the licensing to use it will, in a real sense, have access to information that the rest of the region cannot get. For the people on the coast, the situation is just beginning, because while the shaking has stopped, the wave has not yet arrived. Part 7. The Wave That Follows. The Cascadia tsunami is generated by the sudden vertical motion of the seafloor when the upper plate snaps westward in the earthquake. The displacement is on the order of 3 to 5 meters across a region hundreds of kilometers long and tens of kilometers wide. That is an enormous volume of water lifted, and another enormous volume dropped in a few seconds. The disturbance radiates outward as a long wavelength wave. In deep water, the wave is barely visible from the surface. Its amplitude is small, perhaps less than a meter in the open ocean. Its wavelength is enormous, on the order of hundreds of kilometers. A ship at sea would barely notice it pass beneath the hull. But as the wave approaches the coast, the water shoals. The wavelength shortens, the amplitude grows. By the time the wave reaches the shore, it has been compressed and amplified into a wall of water that can be tens of meters tall. For the Pacific Northwest, the tsunami arrival time at the outer coast is expected to be between 10 and 20 minutes after the start of shaking. That is the shortest tsunami arrival time of any tsunami source affecting the continental United States. The Aleutian source can give the Pacific Northwest several hours of warning. A South American source can give half a day. A Pacific Basin teleseismic source, the kind that hit Hawaii and the West Coast after the Tohoku event in 2011, can give many hours. Cascadia gives 10 minutes, 20 if you are lucky, and the bathymetry between you and the source delays the wave. That is the entire window in which to recognize what has happened, decide where to go, and get there. The expected wave heights vary along the coast, depending on local bathymetry, coastal geometry, and the position of the location relative to the slip distribution. The Pacific Marine Environmental Laboratory's Center for Tsunami Research, working with the Washington Geological Survey and the Oregon Department of Geology and Mineral Industries, has produced detailed inundation maps for the entire outer coast. The maps now form the basis for evacuation planning in every coastal community. The numbers are, depending on the location, between 10 and 30 meters of wave height at the shoreline, up to 100 feet of water at some locations. The wave will not stop at the beach. It will run inland for hundreds of meters, in some places more than a mile depending on the topography. Anywhere within the inundation zone is simply lost. The first wave will not be the largest. Tsunamis arrive as wave trains. The first wave is followed by a second, sometimes larger, then a third, then more. The pattern continues for hours. During the Tohoku tsunami in Japan in 2011, The largest waves at many locations arrived between 40 and 60 minutes after the first wave. The wave train continued for 6 to 12 hours, with significant waves still arriving in some places nearly a day after the initial event. The Pacific Northwest can expect the same pattern. The danger does not end when the first wave passes. The danger lasts most of a day. Tens of thousands of people live within the projected inundation zones along the outer coast. Hundreds of thousands more visit, especially during the summer months when coastal tourism peaks. There are towns where essentially the entire built environment is in the inundation zone: Seaside, Oregon, Cannon Beach, Newport, Coos Bay, Long Beach, Washington, Ocean Shores, Westport, La Push, Near Bay. In each of these places, the path to high ground is a path that everyone in town must take in the same 10 or 20 minutes. In many of these places, the path crosses a river on a bridge, or follows a low-lying corridor that the wave itself will use, or requires running uphill on legs that are not always physically capable of running uphill. Consider Seaside, Oregon. It is a beautiful town of about 7,000 year-round residents, with several times that many visitors in the warm months. It sits on a low-lying plain between the Pacific Ocean and a coastal range. To get from sea level to safe high ground, you have to cross either the Nekanicum River or its tributaries. There are 3 bridges across those waterways within the town. All 3 were built before plate tectonics was a settled science. None of them was designed for the loadings that the Cascadia Megaquake will impose. The Oregon Department of Transportation's own damage projections suggest that the bridges are very likely to fail during the shaking. If the bridges fail, the evacuation routes are cut. People will have to swim a river that is full of debris, broken pipes, fuel slicks, and the kinds of objects that get washed off the streets and out of houses by water, moving at the speed of a riding lawnmower. Then they will have to keep running uphill, away from the wave that is coming. The town has done what it can to plan for this. There are tsunami evacuation signs, there are designated assembly points, there are practice drills. The school district has built a high school on higher ground, designed to function partly as a community evacuation refuge, but for anyone who's in town when the earthquake hits, in any of the low-lying districts west of the highway, with bridges that are very likely to be gone, the evacuation will be on foot, in shoes that may not have been laced up, in weather that may be January and wet, in a moving crowd of people who are bleeding or carrying their children or trying to find their parents. And the wave will arrive in 15 minutes, maybe 20. The Shoalwater Bay Indian tribe on the southwestern Washington coast looked at the same problem and decided that the bridges and the foot evacuation were not enough. In 2022, the tribe completed construction of a 50-foot-tall vertical evacuation tower at Tokeland, Washington. The structure is anchored into the ground with support piers reaching down 55 feet, designed to remain standing through the strongest expected shaking and to remain above the highest expected tsunami run-up. It can shelter approximately 400 people. It has water, propane, electricity, heaters, and tarps that can be deployed around its perimeter to provide weather protection for survivors. Tribal Chairman Quinton Swanson has spoken publicly about the tower as a survival measure, not just for tribal members, but for anyone on the southern Long Beach Peninsula who needs to reach high ground in the minutes after the shaking stops. The tribe has acquired approximately 4,000 acres of higher elevation land and has begun the process of relocating its village uphill, out of the inundation zone. As of this writing, the Auntie Lee Tower at Tokeland remains the only operational purpose-built vertical tsunami evacuation tower in the continental United States. One tower, on one tribal reservation, for a coastline that stretches 600 miles and contains dozens of vulnerable communities. That tribe acted because they remembered what was coming, and they decided to be ready. The rest of the coast, by and large, has not yet made the same decision, and the implications of that gap are what the rest of this video is going to take apart. Because the question is not whether the wave will come. The wave is built into the geometry of the locked Cascadia interface, as inevitably as gravity is built into the rest of the planet. The question is who, when the wave comes, will be in a position to survive it, and the answer, for most of the Pacific Northwest, is much smaller than it needs to be. There is one more dimension of the tsunami threat that is worth being explicit about, because it is sometimes missed in coverage of the issue. The wave will damage things that are not directly under the wave. The tsunami will carry with it everything that is not anchored down. Houses will be lifted off their foundations and carried inland. Vehicles will be picked up and thrown like debris. Boats in coastal harbours will be lifted out of the water and deposited on streets, on rooftops, in fields. Fuel tanks at coastal facilities will rupture and discharge their contents into the moving water. Industrial chemicals stored in coastal warehouses will mix with the seawater and the debris. Bodies, both human and animal, will be carried by the water. The wave that recedes carries all of that material back out to sea, and the next wave carries it back in again, more violently, with the previous wave's debris becoming projectiles for the next. The reason that tsunami damage is so devastating, beyond the simple fact of inundation, is that the wave converts everything it touches into a weapon and uses each successive wave's energy to drive the weapons through whatever is still standing. After a tsunami of the size that Cascadia will produce, the affected coastal communities will not simply be flooded. They will in many cases be physically scoured away. The houses will not be standing with water inside them. The houses will be gone. The streets will not be cleanable. The streets will not exist in their previous form. Rebuilding will not be a matter of cleanup. It will be a matter of starting over. And the starting over will take place under conditions in which the access roads are broken, the fuel supply is on fire in Portland, the power is out for an enormous region, and the federal disaster response is being stretched thinner than it has ever been stretched in the country's history. Part 8. 7 million people. The number that focuses the mind when you're thinking about the Cascadia Megaquake is 7 million. That is the approximate population currently living within the strong shaking zone of a full margin rupture, distributed across the 4 major metropolitan areas and the long string of smaller cities and coastal towns that lie within the affected region. Seattle metropolitan area, approximately 4 million people. Portland metropolitan area, approximately 2.5 million. Vancouver, British Columbia metropolitan area, approximately 2.5 million, of which a significant fraction would experience strong shaking. Victoria, British Columbia, about 400,000. Outer coast populations and smaller inland cities across Oregon, Washington, southwestern British Columbia, and far northern California, together adding several 100,000 more. 7 million is more than the entire population of New York City. It is more than the entire population of Israel, of Switzerland, of Hong Kong. It is approaching the entire population of Bulgaria. It is, by any reasonable measure, an enormous urban concentration, and it is going to experience, all at once, the same earthquake. Within that 7 million, a smaller and more critical figure is the population inside the tsunami inundation zone along the outer coast. That number is on the order of 70 to 100,000 permanent residents, depending on exactly how the inundation zones are drawn for each community. In summer, with tourists and seasonal visitors added, the population at risk in the inundation zone can be twice that or more. These are the people who will have at most 10 to 20 minutes to reach high ground. Many of them, given the geography and the state of the local infrastructure, will not make it. The inland population, the people in Portland and Seattle and Vancouver and Victoria and Tacoma and Eugene and Olympia, and the dozens of smaller cities of the I-5 corridor, will not be facing the tsunami. They will be facing the shaking, the damage, the cascading failures of utilities, transportation, and supply chains, and the long, slow recovery that follows. They will not die in the wave. They will in many cases die in their homes when the floor falls out from under them, or the unsecured chimney collapses on top of them, or the gas line ignites in the wall behind them. They will die when the apartment building fails. They will die when the highway overpass comes down on the lane they are driving in. They will die when the hospital they need to reach is itself badly damaged and cannot admit new patients for hours or days. They will die when the rescue cannot reach them, because the bridges between the rescuers and the survivors are gone, and the roads in are blocked, and the airports are closed because the runways are cracked, or the control towers are damaged, or the fuel supply is on fire at the CEI hub. The estimates of total fatalities for a full margin Cascadia event vary widely depending on which scenario you model and which assumptions you make. The lower bound estimates run to approximately 10,000. The upper bound estimates run to over 100,000. The displaced population estimates run from 1 million to 2 million people who will lose their homes, their workplaces, or both. The economic damage estimates run from hundreds of billions of dollars to over $1 trillion. There is no number in any of those ranges that does not represent the largest natural disaster in American history. There is no scenario in which the Cascadia event is anything other than the worst thing that has ever happened to the country. And the reason for that, the simple geometric reason, is that the region that the earthquake will hit was built without knowing the earthquake was coming. The cities are concentrated, the infrastructure is interconnected, the fuel supply is concentrated in a single liquefiable corridor in northwest Portland. The bridges across the major rivers are old, the hospitals are in mixed condition, the schools include a long list of unreinforced masonry buildings that are still in use. The housing stock west of the Cascades is dominated by older wood frame homes, many of which have never been retrofitted for seismic loading. The CEI hub is still there. The Burnside Bridge is still there in its 1926 form, with replacement plans approved but construction not yet begun. The unreinforced masonry inventory of downtown Portland, downtown Seattle, downtown Olympia, downtown Bellingham is still substantially intact. None of these vulnerabilities is secret. None of them is unknown to the agencies and the legislatures responsible for them. They are known. They simply have not yet been fixed. And the timeline for fixing them is now in a race against the timeline of the elastic strain accumulating offshore. 7 million people, 70,000 to 100,000 in the inundation zone, tens of thousands at risk in URMs, hundreds of thousands at risk in non-ductile concrete buildings, hundreds of thousands more at risk in unbolted older wood frame homes. Every one of those people is right now going about their day. They are commuting to work, they are dropping kids off at school, they are buying groceries, they are scheduling dentist appointments. They are, in some statistically significant fraction of cases, doing none of the simple preparedness work that would, when the day comes, materially improve their odds. The reason is not stupidity. The reason is that an inevitable but unpredictable hazard, with a recurrence interval longer than a human lifetime, is exactly the kind of threat that civilizations are bad at preparing for. We respond to the immediate, we discount the distant, we treat probability as if it were not really probability, but rather a euphemism for never. And the next Cascadia earthquake is going to hit a region of 7 million people who, on average, have not done what they could do to be ready. Within that 7 million, there is enormous variation in individual readiness. There are households that have stocked 2 weeks of food and water, mounted their televisions to the wall, bolted their bookshelves to the studs, identified their evacuation route, practiced it with their kids, and put their important documents in a waterproof container. There are households that have done none of that keep no extra food in the pantry beyond what they will eat in the next 3 days, that have unsecured bookcases in the bedrooms, that have never thought about where they would go if the bridges came down. There are households in the middle that have done some of it and not the rest. The distribution of readiness across the region is highly uneven, and the survival outcomes after the event will be correspondingly uneven. The households that have prepared will, in many cases, ride out the first weeks without becoming a burden on the rescue capacity. The households that have not prepared will in many cases be unable to feed themselves, unable to get clean water, unable to communicate, unable to provide basic care for their own children in the first chaotic days. The math of disaster response is brutal in this respect. The rescue capacity is finite. Every household that can take care of itself for the first 2 weeks frees up capacity to help the households that cannot. The cumulative effect of household-level preparation across the region is one of the largest single factors in the eventual death toll. The good news, such as it is that the household preparation work is not expensive. The basic 2 weeks ready supply list, food and water and a few inexpensive supplies, can be assembled for a few $100s per person over the course of a few months by buying a few extra cans of soup each grocery trip and a few extra gallons of water each month. It is, in the most concrete sense, the easiest part of the preparation problem, and it is the part that, statistically, has the highest payoff at the individual household level. The hard part of the regional preparation, the multi-billion-dollar bridge and fuel hub and URM retrofit work, is not something that any individual household can solve. But the 2 weeks ready preparation is, and the gap between households that have done it and households that have not is, when the event comes, the gap between survival and not. The other good news in the same restricted sense is that the gap is closing. Public awareness campaigns by the Oregon Office of Emergency Management, the Washington Emergency Management Division, and similar agencies in British Columbia and Northern California have made meaningful progress. School-based earthquake drills are now an annual fixture for most public school students in the region. The Cascadia Rising exercises have trained thousands of emergency responders. The neighborhood emergency team programs in Portland and other cities have produced a corps of trained volunteers. The state-level building code updates have raised the standard for new construction. None of this is a substitute for the larger infrastructure work, but it is real work, and it has measurable effects at the individual and household level. The bad news, which is the part that almost no one wants to face, is that the gap is closing slowly. The pace of preparation is, in the most charitable estimate, several orders of magnitude slower than the pace at which the strain is accumulating. The strain has been accumulating for 3 centuries. The preparation has been accumulating for 3 decades. The strain is on the verge of release. The preparation is on the verge of being insufficient. And the regional choices, the political and economic choices that would close the gap faster, have been made in a way that has prioritized other things. The 70% of the urban infrastructure that does not meet modern seismic codes was given that opportunity to be brought into compliance over the last 3 decades. In most cases, the opportunity was not taken. The reason was almost always the same. The cost was real and the date of the earthquake was uncertain, and so the work was deferred to a future budget cycle, which became the next future budget cycle, which became the budget cycle after that. The pattern is human, and the pattern is understandable. The pattern is also exactly the pattern that produces the worst possible outcome when the date of the earthquake finally arrives. Part 9. What Japan taught the world and what Cascadia will teach it next. The closest analogue to what is coming to the Pacific Northwest, the only place in the modern world that has experienced an event of the same scale, is the Tohoku coast of northeastern Japan, on the 11th of March, 2011. On that day, at 2:46 in the afternoon local time, the Japan Trench subduction zone ruptured along a segment about 500 kilometers long. The earthquake had a moment magnitude of 9.0. The strong shaking lasted approximately 6 minutes. The tsunami that followed reached the Sanriku coast within 20 to 30 minutes and produced maximum wave heights of approximately 40 meters at the most extreme run-up locations. Roughly 20,000 people died, either in the shaking or far more commonly in the wave. Approximately 120,000 buildings were destroyed. The Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant lost cooling, and 3 of its reactors melted down. The economic damage exceeded $210 billion and made the Tohoku event at the time the costliest natural disaster in recorded history. What makes the Tohoku event the critical analogue is not the magnitude alone. It is the magnitude combined with the level of preparation in the country that experienced it. Japan in 2011 was, by global standards, exceptionally well prepared for a megathrust earthquake. The country had, after the 1896 Meiji Sanriku tsunami and the 1933 Showa Sanriku tsunami, invested decades of effort into coastal protection. Tsunami walls had been built along extensive portions of the Sanriku coastline with engineered heights of 5 to 10 meters above sea level. Coastal evacuation routes had been mapped, marked with signage, and rehearsed in regular drills. Public schools conducted tsunami evacuation exercises annually. The Japan Meteorological Agency operated a sophisticated tsunami warning system that could issue alerts within minutes of an earthquake. Building codes were among the strictest in the world. Most modern construction, especially in earthquake-prone coastal cities, was built to withstand magnitude 8 shaking and to remain at least partially functional after the event. And yet, on the 11th of March 2011, despite all of that, 20,000 people died. The tsunami walls were overtopped at multiple locations along the Sanriku coast. The waves reached heights that exceeded the design assumptions of the protective infrastructure. Cars that were evacuating uphill were overtaken by the water. Towns that had practiced for the wave were inundated by waves larger than the practice scenarios had assumed. Whole districts of Kisanuma, Rikuzentakata, Onagawa, and other coastal cities were swept away. The town of Otsuchi lost its mayor, who was in the middle of a meeting in the town hall when the wave arrived. Schools that had been built as evacuation refuges were, in some cases, themselves inundated when the wave proved taller than the rooftop refuge level. The lesson from Tohoku is simple and devastating. Even with decades of preparation, even with the best tsunami walls in the world, even with a sophisticated warning system and a culture of disaster readiness, a full magnitude 9 subduction zone event killed 20,000 people in Japan in 2011. The reason was that the event was bigger than the planning. The waves were taller than the walls, the shaking was stronger than the design loads. The arrival time was shorter than the evacuation could accomplish in some places. The preparation was world-leading, and it was not enough. Now consider the Pacific Northwest. The Cascadia subduction zone was definitively identified as a megathrust hazard in approximately 1988. The recurrent statistics were not robustly developed until the 2000s. The Shake Alert earthquake early warning system has been operational at scale for less than a decade. Tsunami inundation maps for the full outer coast have been available for less than 20 years. The Oregon Resilience Plan, the multi-volume planning document that lays out what needs to be done to prepare the state for a Cascadia event, was published in 2013. Its recommendations have been partially implemented. The Cascadia Rising emergency exercises have been conducted at intervals to test interagency response capacity. The most recent major exercise was in 2022. The lessons learned have been documented, and they have been published, and in many cases they have not yet been acted on at scale. The honest assessment, delivered repeatedly by Pacific Northwest seismologists, is that the region is roughly 30 to 50 years behind Japan in earthquake preparedness. Chris Goldfinger, the Oregon State paleoseismologist, whose offshore turbidite work established the long recurrence record, has been particularly direct about this in public statements. When he visited Japan in March 2011, he was inside the building where the Tohoku earthquake was felt. He watched the structure perform exactly as Japanese seismic engineering had designed it to perform. The building was fine, the flagpoles swung, the light fixtures swung. The shaking was severe, but the structure was undamaged, and when Goldfinger came home to Oregon, he stood in his own office, a typical mid-20th century Oregon State academic building, and he looked at it the way he had just looked at the Japanese building. And he said publicly that his office building would have collapsed if the same earthquake had occurred under Oregon instead of under Honshu. The contrast was not subtle. It is worth understanding what that contrast actually means at the population level. In Japan in 2011, a country with world-leading preparation lost 20,000 people. In the Pacific Northwest in some future year, a region that is several decades behind Japan in preparation will face the same event. The population at risk is in the same range. The geometry of the fault is similar. The wave heights, depending on local bathymetry, may be larger. The infrastructure is more vulnerable. The number of unreinforced masonry buildings, of non-ductile concrete buildings, of unbolted older homes, of liquefiable foundations, of 1920s vintage bridges in active use. All of this is materially worse in the Pacific Northwest than it was on the Sanriku coast in 2011. The honest range for Cascadia fatalities, accounting for the reduced preparation relative to Japan, is somewhere between Tohoku's 20,000 and a multiple of it. And that fatality number is, perhaps, not even the worst part of the comparison. The economic damage from Tohoku exceeded $200 billion and disrupted the Japanese economy for years. The total cost of the Fukushima nuclear meltdown alone is now estimated in the hundreds of billions over the multi-decade timeline of the cleanup. Japan, the third largest economy in the world at the time, absorbed the shock and continued to function, but it was not easy, and it was not free. The Pacific Northwest will lose in a Cascadia event an economy roughly comparable in size. The recovery cost will compete with the federal disaster response budget for years. The displaced population numbers will be in the seven figures. The disruption to West Coast supply chains, to the ports of Seattle, Tacoma, and Portland, to the regional aerospace and technology industries, to agricultural exports, to the cross-border trade with Canada, will reverberate through the national economy for a decade. This is what Tohoku has taught the world. A magnitude 9 subduction zone earthquake in a prepared country kills 20,000 people. In a less prepared region, it kills many more. The next chapter of the lesson will be written by the Pacific Northwest, and the only question that remains is how much of the work of getting ready will be done before the chapter is written, and how much will have to be done in the aftermath, in conditions that no one wants to face. The clock of inevitability ticks faster than the clock of preparation. That is the real lesson, and it is the one that the country so far has not fully absorbed. One specific detail from the Tohoku event deserves particular attention because it captures the difficulty of the broader problem. After the 1996 dating of the 1700 Cascadia event, and after the development of the long-term turbidite record by Goldfinger and his collaborators, the parallel work in Japan on the historical record of Sanriku megaquakes had also produced a long-term picture. The Japanese knew before 2011 that great earthquakes had hit the Sanriku coast in 1896, 1933, and going back further into the historical record in 1896, in 1793, in 1586, and in 869. The Jogan earthquake of 869 in particular had produced a tsunami that paleoseismic studies were beginning to suggest had been comparable in scale to what would actually hit in 2011. The historical record was visible to the Japanese scientific and emergency management communities before the 2011 event. The published literature included papers explicitly warning that the Jogan-scale event could recur. The Tokyo Electric Power Company, which operated the Fukushima Daiichi reactors, had been given the Jogan analogue by its own consulting seismologists, and had not, for various corporate reasons, redesigned the seawalls at the plant to handle the larger possible event. The Tohoku tsunami arrived. The seawalls were overtopped. The reactors melted down. The Jogan warning, available in the literature for decades, had not been translated into operational changes in time. That is the Tohoku lesson that the Pacific Northwest most needs to absorb. The science was available. The warning was published. The recurrent statistics were calibrated, and the institutional response was inadequate. The exact same conditions are now present in the Pacific Northwest. The science is published. The warning has been issued repeatedly by the USGS, by the Oregon and Washington State Geological Surveys, by Canadian and American academic seismologists. The recurrent statistics are calibrated, and the institutional response, in critical respects, has been inadequate. The CI hub is the most obvious example, but it is far from the only one. The pattern of warning issued, response delayed, is the same one that produced Fukushima, and the consequences, when the Pacific Northwest's version of Fukushima arrives, will be measured at a regional scale rather than at the scale of a single power plant. Part 10. The Indigenous Memory. There is a part of this story that does not get told as often as it should be, and it is the part that, in some ways, is the most remarkable of all. Long before the marsh stratigraphers and the dendrochronologists and the Japanese archivists and the offshore corers had assembled the modern scientific picture of the Cascadia hazard, the people who had been living on the Pacific Northwest coast for thousands of years already knew. They knew because they remembered, and they remembered because they had been telling each other for 326 years what had happened on a winter night in 1700. The coastal tribes of the Pacific Northwest, the Quileute, the Hoh, the Makah, the Quinault, the Tillamook, the Yurok and many others, have preserved oral accounts of catastrophic earthshakings and great waves that swept their ancestors away. These accounts describe a sudden subsidence of the coastal land. They describe waves of water that destroyed villages along the shoreline. In some versions they specify the season, late autumn or winter. In some versions they specify the time of day, night. They describe specific village sites that were lost, locations that can in some cases be matched to the modern geological record of buried marshes and tsunami sand deposits. They describe the survivors having to find higher ground in the dark, while the cold water rose around them. They have been told by elders to children, in language after language, generation after generation, for over 300 years. For most of the 20th century, these accounts were either not taken seriously by the dominant scientific culture, or were not in conversation with the scientific work being done on the same coastline. The geologists were digging in the marshes and finding sand layers without knowing that the people whose ancestors had walked across those same marshes had been telling the story for 3 centuries. The dendrochronologists were counting tree rings without realizing that the trees they were counting were the same trees that the tribal accounts described being killed by the wave. The connection, in the end, came partly through scientific work and partly through a few researchers who took the oral histories seriously as a line of evidence and asked what they implied, and worked with tribal communities to integrate that evidence with the rest of the picture. What emerged from that integration is one of the more striking examples in modern earth science of indigenous knowledge being independently corroborated by mainstream scientific data. The marsh stratigraphy says the land dropped. The oral histories say the land dropped. The tree rings say the killing happened in winter, between the autumn of 1699 and the spring of 1700. The oral histories say the killing happened in winter, at night. The Japanese archives say the wave hit Japan in the early hours of the morning local time on January 28th, which back calculates to 9 in the evening Pacific Standard Time on the 26th. The oral histories do not, in most versions, attempt to specify the exact date by a calendar that the recorders did not use, but they consistently describe a winter event, at night, with shaking and a great wave. The convergence of these 4 lines of evidence, 3 of them from Western science and 1 from indigenous oral tradition, is one of the longest continuous oral history records of a natural disaster anywhere in the world, and it pins the timing of the 1700 event to a level of precision that no other prehistoric earthquake has achieved. There is a lesson in this convergence that goes beyond the particulars of one event. The Pacific Northwest has been warned, by people who lived through the last megaquake and told their descendants what happened, for 326 years. The warning predates Western science. It predates the founding of the United States. It predates the European discovery of the Pacific coast of North America. The information has been in continuous circulation among the coastal tribes since the original event. The information was correct. The integration with the modern scientific record is, in retrospect, simply confirmation of what the people who had been there had been saying all along. And that confirmation matters for the rest of this story, because the geological record alone could be doubted by those who wished to doubt it. The tree rings alone could be questioned by those who wished to question them. The Japanese archives, sitting in storerooms in Honshu, could be argued with by those who wished to argue. But the convergence of all 4 lines, with the indigenous oral histories tracking the scientific work as closely as any geophysical dataset would, is a level of corroboration that cannot reasonably be disputed. The 1700 earthquake happened. It happened on a winter night. It happened on January 26th. It happened at 9 in the evening, and the people who watched it happen left behind a record in 3 different forms, and that record has now been read. The implication for the future is hard to escape. The clock that started on that winter night in 1700 has been running ever since. The strain that began accumulating the moment the rupture ended has been accumulating without interruption for 326 years. The thread of warning that the survivors of 1700 wove into the oral traditions of their descendants has been running for the same 3 centuries. The tribes have remembered. The geology has remembered. The Japanese records have remembered. The only ones who have, until very recently, forgotten are the people who built the cities and the bridges and the fuel depots in the assumption that the ground beneath them was stable. The 1700 earthquake was not just history. It was a message sent across centuries from people who watched the coast go under. And the message has reached us. The question is whether we will treat it as a message or treat it as something we can choose to set aside. Part 11. Drop Cover and the Limits of a 1950s Slogan. When the next Cascadia earthquake begins, the standard public safety messaging that every resident of the Pacific Northwest has been taught is 3 short words: drop, cover, hold on. You drop to the ground. You take cover under a sturdy piece of furniture, like a desk or a heavy table, or against an interior wall away from windows. You hold on to whatever is sheltering you until the shaking stops. Then you check yourself for injuries. You check those around you, and you respond as the situation requires. The advice has the virtue of being easy to remember. It is uniform across school drills, public service announcements, agency websites, and emergency preparedness pamphlets. It is taught in every kindergarten in California, Oregon, and Washington. It is illustrated on posters in every public building. It is the standard. It also has a history that, if you trace it back, is not exactly a history of earthquake engineering. The phrase duck and cover was popularized in the early 1950s by a civil defense film featuring a cartoon turtle named Bert. The film was designed to teach American schoolchildren what to do in the event of a nuclear attack. The recommended action was to get under your desk, which would provide some shielding from flying debris and the initial flash of the bomb. When the Cold War civil defense apparatus was eventually wound down, the duck and cover message was repurposed for a broader range of hazards, including earthquakes. The cartoon turtle migrated from one threat scenario to another. The advice was, in some respects, the right advice for the original threat, and it has been adapted to a new threat without much critical examination of whether the adaptation actually serves the new context. For short, sharp crustal earthquakes, in modern code-compliant buildings, drop cover hold on is generally appropriate. The shaking starts and stops within 20 to 30 seconds. The principal danger is falling objects rather than structural collapse. Getting under a desk or table protects against the falling objects. Staying put avoids the risk of trying to evacuate during the shaking, which can be hazardous in itself. For that scenario, the advice is reasonable. For a magnitude 9 megathrust event lasting 3 to 5 minutes, In a region where 70% of urban infrastructure does not meet modern seismic codes, the calculation is less straightforward. Chris Goldfinger has made this point publicly, repeatedly, for years. The issue is that the shaking from Cascadia, in inland cities like Portland and Seattle, that are about 100 kilometers from the fault, will not begin instantly. The earthquake's primary waves, the P waves, travel through the rock faster than the more destructive shear waves and surface waves. The P waves arrive at inland cities a minute or so before the S waves. The P wave shaking is light. It feels like a vibration. It is not enough to bring down a building, but it is enough to alert a paying attention occupant that an earthquake has started. In that minute of warning, a person in a single-family wood-frame home should generally drop cover hold on, because the falling object risk is real and the structural collapse risk is low. A person in a modern, code-compliant office building should generally do the same, because the structure is designed to survive the shaking and the falling object risk inside is again the primary danger. A person in an unreinforced masonry building, or in an older non-ductile concrete building, is in a much more difficult situation. Those buildings are likely to fail in the strong shaking that will follow the P waves. Staying inside a URM during a magnitude 9 event is, in many cases, a death sentence. Goldfinger's argument is that someone in that situation, with a minute of warning, should evacuate the building, ideally to an open area away from the masonry facade that will fall outward into the street. Drop cover hold on in a URM is, in his framing, the wrong advice, even if it is the standard advice. The mainstream emergency management response to this argument has been mixed. The concern is that adding situational awareness to the messaging makes it more complicated, and a more complicated message is harder to deliver in a 30-second public service announcement. There is also the concern that telling people to evaluate their building during an earthquake puts more cognitive load on them than they can be expected to manage in a moment of stress, and that telling them to evacuate might cause some people to evacuate from modern code-compliant buildings, where they would be safer staying put and end up in the streets where they are more vulnerable. The trade-offs are not trivial, and reasonable people in earthquake engineering and disaster preparedness agencies disagree about the right balance. Goldfinger's position, articulated in interviews and public talks, is that the messaging is calibrated to the average earthquake and not to Cascadia. The average earthquake is short in a region of mixed but mostly modern construction, and is well served by drop cover hold on. Cascadia is a different problem. The duration is longer, the warning window is longer, the building stock is older. The situational awareness calculus, in his view, is different enough that the standard advice may cost more lives than it saves. The same situational awareness problem applies, in a different form, on the coast. The drop cover hold-on model says nothing about tsunamis. For coastal residents, the priority is not riding out the shaking under a desk. The priority is reaching high ground before the wave arrives, which will be in 10 to 20 minutes. The standard public safety messaging in coastal communities is now relatively clear on this point. If you're on the coast and the ground shakes for more than approximately 20 seconds, do not wait for any official warning. Move to high ground or to a designated vertical evacuation structure immediately. But that messaging is in conflict with the inland messaging, and the conflict is sometimes confusing for residents who do not live on the coast but visit it, or for visitors who do not know which set of rules applies where they are. There is finally the matter of what to do before the earthquake at all. The Shake Alert system, operated by the United States Geological Survey in partnership with universities and state agencies, is now operational across the West Coast. It detects the initial P wave from an earthquake and issues a warning to areas that have not yet been reached by the S waves. For Cascadia, the warning at inland cities is expected to give 1 to several minutes of lead time, depending on distance from the rupture. That is enough to take an action. It is enough to step away from a falling object. It is enough to move toward an exit. It is enough in some cases to make the difference between life and death. But Shake Alert is only useful if the people who receive the alert know how to use the warning time, and if they have decided in advance what action they will take. Standing in place and staring at the alert message on a phone screen is not by itself a survival strategy. Knowing the answer in advance is. The messaging gap is one more dimension of the broader inadequacy of preparation. The civilization that built the cities of the Pacific Northwest, before it understood the fault, has been very slow to update its survival heuristics now that it does. The 1700 earthquake came at night, in winter, to a population that did not know it was coming. The next Cascadia event will come at some hour, in some season, to a population that does know, and that has known for 3 decades, and that has not yet fully translated the knowledge into the simple practical question of what to do in the first 30 seconds. The gap between knowing and acting is in some ways the most stubborn gap of all, and the seconds in which it has to be closed are the seconds the Megaquake itself will not return. Part 12. The country that comes out. The other side. The Cascadia subduction zone is locked. It is loaded. It is inevitable. The geology has been clear about this for 3 decades. The recurrent statistics are unambiguous. The fault will rupture. The shaking will last 3 to 5 minutes. The tsunami will arrive within 10 to 20 minutes. The damage will be measured in the hundreds of billions of dollars, in tens or hundreds of thousands of fatalities, in displacement of 1 to 2 million people, in the longest and most difficult disaster recovery in the history of the country. None of this is speculation. It is the standard reading of the published literature, agreed on by essentially every earthquake engineering and seismological agency that has examined the question. The only thing that is uncertain is the timing. The 1700 event was 326 years ago. The southern segment's mean recurrence is 240 years. The full margin's mean recurrence is 530 years. The 50-year probability for a southern segment rupture is 37%. The 50-year probability for a full margin rupture is 10 to 15%. The next earthquake could happen this year. It could happen in 50 years. It could happen in 200 years. The probability density function is broad. The expected value is sooner rather than later. Nobody who studies this for a living believes that the Pacific Northwest has another century of grace before the next event. What is the Pacific Northwest doing with the time it still has? The honest answer is, more than it was doing 20 years ago, but less than the magnitude of the threat warrants. The Oregon Resilience Plan exists and has identified the critical lifelines that need to be hardened. Shake Alert is operational. Tsunami inundation maps are published. Cascadia rising exercises are held. The Multnomah County Earthquake-Ready Burnside Bridge project has been planned. The Shoalwater Bay tribe has built its vertical evacuation tower. School districts have, in some cases, retrofitted their buildings. The city of Portland has mapped its unreinforced masonry inventory. 2 weeks ready preparedness campaigns are ongoing in Oregon and Washington. Neighborhood emergency teams have been organized in many communities. A handful of households have begun to maintain the food, water, and supplies that would let them be self-sufficient for 14 days after the event. This is not nothing. It is real work, and the people doing it deserve recognition for doing it. What is the Pacific Northwest not yet doing? It has not retrofitted most of its unreinforced masonry building stock. It has not mitigated the critical energy infrastructure hub. It has not replaced or seismically strengthened most of its older bridges. It has not built vertical evacuation infrastructure for most of its outer coast communities. It has not adopted statewide mandatory retrofit programs for older homes. It has not, in most places, integrated situational awareness messaging into its public earthquake preparedness materials. It has not, in any meaningful sense, achieved the level of preparation that Japan achieved before 2011, where decades of dedicated investment produced a level of resilience that still left 20,000 people dead when the magnitude 9 event finally came. The Pacific Northwest is several decades behind Japan, and the clock is running. And so the closing question, the one that this video has been building toward, is the one that doesn't have a clean answer. It is the question of what happens after. The country has been through major disasters before. Hurricane Katrina killed approximately 1,800 people and produced about $125 billion in damages. The 1906 San Francisco earthquake killed about 3,000 people and destroyed most of a major American city. September 11th killed about 3,000 people and reshaped the foreign and domestic policy of the country for 2 decades. Each of those events was, in its time, the largest disaster the country had recently experienced. The country survived each of them and was changed by each of them. The Cascadia event will be larger than any of those in every measurable dimension. The fatalities will be higher, the economic damage will be larger, the displaced population numbers will be larger, the geographic footprint of the affected zone will be larger, the recovery time will be longer, The country that exists on the other side of the Cascadia earthquake will not be the same country that existed on the morning of the earthquake. The Pacific Northwest, as currently configured, will have to be substantially rebuilt. The political, economic, and cultural consequences will reverberate through the rest of the country for decades. What kind of country comes out the other side? That depends, to a degree that most of us are not yet willing to acknowledge, on the choices that are being made right now in advance of the event, while there is still time. Every URM that gets retrofitted now is a building that does not collapse on its occupants then. Every older home that gets bolted to its foundation now is a family that does not lose its house then. Every fuel tank at the CEI hub that gets structurally upgraded now is a fire that does not burn out of control then. Every coastal community that builds a vertical evacuation tower now is a few hundred people who do not drown then. Every household that maintains 2 weeks of food and water now is a household that does not become a burden on the rescue capacity in the first chaotic days. The choices are not abstract. The probabilities are not abstract. The math, frankly, is not particularly complicated. The hard part is the willingness to act on it. There is a version of this story in which the Pacific Northwest, in the time it still has, does the work, in which the retrofits get done, the infrastructure gets hardened, the vertical evacuation gets built, the fuel hub gets relocated or rebuilt, the hospitals get reinforced, the schools get upgraded, the households get prepared, and when the megaquake comes, as it will, the region survives it as something more like Japan in 2011 than something far worse. In that version, the death toll is in the thousands rather than the tens of thousands. The recovery is in the years rather than the decades. The country comes out the other side as something recognizable, scarred but intact. There is another version in which the work does not get done, in which the elastic strain continues to accumulate, while the political and economic systems that could mitigate the consequences continue to defer the cost, in which the next earthquake hits a region that is no better prepared than it is today. In that version, the death toll is the worst in American history. The recovery is the longest in American history. The political and economic shock reshapes the country in ways that no other disaster has. The country comes out the other side as something different, harder to recognize, marked permanently by what it could have done and did not. Both versions are possible. Both versions are consistent with the same underlying geology, the same locked interface, the same accumulating strain, the same inevitable rupture. The difference between the two versions is the choices made in the time between this moment and the moment when the rock finally gives way. There is no third version in which the earthquake does not come. There is no version in which the inevitability is somehow negotiated down to nothing. The strain is real. The fault is real. The clock has been running since 9 in the evening on January 26, 1700, and whatever comes next, when it comes, will be a measure of what the country chose to do during the centuries in between. The Cascadia megaquake is inevitable. It will be the worst disaster in American history. The only question left, the one that this video has been circling all along, is whether the country that emerges on the other side is the one that did the work, or the one that ran out of time. There is a thought experiment that geologists sometimes pose to non-specialist audiences when they are trying to convey the strangeness of the situation in concrete terms. It goes like this. Imagine that you live in a house. You know, with absolute certainty, that the house will catch fire at some point. You do not know when. The fire could happen tomorrow. It could happen in 50 years. It could happen, in principle, in 100 years, although the probability decreases the further out you go. You know that the fire will be the worst fire in the recorded history of houses, that it will burn for several minutes at a temperature that current construction materials cannot survive, that it will spread to your neighbours' houses for hundreds of miles in every direction, and that the entire region around you will, when the fire is over, need to be rebuilt from the ashes. You know all of this. The fire department knows all of this. The insurance company knows all of this. The architects who designed the house knew none of it, because they built the house before anyone understood that this kind of fire was possible. The question is what you do now, knowing what you know in the time you still have before the fire arrives. Do you spend money on sprinklers? Do you store the family photos in a fireproof box? Do you maintain the fire extinguishers next to the bed? Do you make your peace with the situation and trust that the fire department will save you when the time comes? Do you move? Do you stay? Most people in the thought experiment do something. They at least buy a fire extinguisher. They at least know where they would go if the alarm went off. The Pacific Northwest, in many cases, is the population in the thought experiment that has, as of yet, done relatively little in the face of certain knowledge that the fire is coming. The hopeful version of this story is the one in which the population, in the time remaining, decides to do the work. The Shoalwater Bay tribe is one example of a community that decided to do the work. They built the tower, they bought the high ground, they are moving their village. Other communities can follow that example. Other households can stock the food and water and supplies. Other property owners can retrofit the buildings they own. The total weight of those individual choices summed across the region is what will determine the death toll when the Megaquake finally hits. The clock is still running.